We all have moments when we wish we could see the people we've lost just one more time. For Jed Harlan, that moment came when he found a tiny cabin deep in the woods that shouldn't have existed. The old mountain man had lived alone for years with just his dog Scout for company. He'd made peace with his solitude and the memories that visited him on quiet evenings. But when he stumbled upon that impossible little cabin, no bigger than a child's playhouse, something stirred in his heart he thought had gone cold long ago. Scout sensed danger and backed away, but Jed felt drawn to that miniature door like a moth to flame. When he turned the tiny doorknob, he discovered something that would change everything he thought he knew about life and loss. What would you do if you found a door that led to everyone you'd ever loved? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun filtered through the pine boughs outside Jed Harlan's cabin, casting long shadows across the worn wooden floors he'd walked for the better part of 2 decades. At 63, his hands bore the permanent stains of wood smoke and honest work, fingers thick as railroad spikes from years of splitting kindling and mending fence. The silver wedding band that once graced his left hand now hung from a thin chain around his neck, nestled close to his heart where Sarah's memory lived strongest. Scout lifted his grizzled head from the braided rug by the stone fireplace, one ear cocked toward the door. The old hound had been Jed's constant companion for 8 years now, arriving as a half-starved pup the winter after Sarah passed. Some folks in town claimed dogs could sense when a man needed saving, and Jed reckoned there might be truth in that. Scout's coat had gone from deep chocolate to silver around the muzzle, matching the grey that now dominated Jed's own beard. "Time for morning rounds, old boy?" Jed's voice carried the roughness of a man who spent more time talking to animals than people. He pulled on his worn leather boots, the same pair Sarah had bought him for Christmas 15 years back. The leather was soft now, broken in like an old friendship, and he couldn't bear to replace them even though the soles were wearing thin. The cabin held 20 years of shared memories in every corner. Sarah's quilt still draped the furniture. Her herb garden still grew wild behind the house, tended now by habit and devotion rather than her gentle hands. Jed had learned to cook her recipes, though they never tasted quite right without her laughter seasoning the air. The rocking chair by the window remained exactly as she'd left it, a small indentation in the cushion where she used to sit and watch the seasons change through the glass. Outside, the Timbervale woods stretched in every direction, a vast green cathedral that had been Jed's church for more years than he cared to count. He knew every trail, every creek crossing, every place where the deer came to drink at dawn. These mountains had been his refuge after Vietnam, when the world felt too loud and too close. Sarah had understood his need for space, for silence, for the kind of peace that only came when you were days away from the nearest neighbor. Scout trotted ahead on the familiar path to the creek, his nose working the morning air for signs of overnight visitors. Raccoons had been raiding the fish traps again, and Jed made a mental note to reset them higher upstream. The rhythm of these morning walks had become sacred to him, a way of honoring the land that had given him so much. Each step was a prayer of sorts, each breath a communion with something larger than himself. The memory of Sarah's final days still visited him in quiet moments like these. He'd been 3 days deep in the backcountry, tracking an injured elk, when Doc Henderson's message finally reached him through old Pete Hawkins, who ran the supply station at Miller's Crossing. By the time Jed made it back to town, Sarah was already in her final sleep, the cancer having taken her voice, but not the gentle smile that graced her face even in unconsciousness. "She kept asking for you," Doc Henderson had said, his own eyes red with grief. "Right up until the morphine took the pain away. Said to tell you the woods would keep you safe, just like they always had." Jed carried that guilt like a stone in his chest, heavy and unyielding. If he'd been there, if he'd stayed closer to home, if he'd noticed the signs earlier when she first started losing weight. The woods that had been his sanctuary became his exile. A place where he could disappear from the world that no longer made sense without Sarah's presence to anchor it. Scout barked once, sharp and alert, bringing Jed back to the present moment. A red-tailed hawk circled overhead, riding the thermals that rose from the warming earth. Life continued its ancient patterns, indifferent to human grief, and there was comfort in that constancy. The creek bubbled over stones worn smooth by countless seasons, and somewhere in the distance a wood thrush called its liquid song into the morning air. "What do you say we check the far meadow today?" Jed asked Scout, who wagged his tail in response. The far meadow was Sarah's favorite place, where wildflowers bloomed in profusion every spring and summer. She used to gather bouquets there, filling the cabin with the sweet scent of lupine and Indian paintbrush. Jed hadn't visited since her funeral, but something in the morning light made him think she might appreciate the gesture. The walk to the far meadow took them deeper into the Timbervale woods than Jed usually ventured these days. The trails here were older, less maintained, winding through stands of ancient Douglas fir and western red cedar that had stood for centuries before the first settlers arrived. This was old-growth forest, the kind that held secrets in its shadows and whispered stories in the wind through its branches. Scout seemed unusually alert as they walked, his ears swiveling at sounds Jed couldn't hear, his nose testing air currents for scents that remained invisible to human senses. The dog had always been sensitive to changes in the forest, sensing storms hours before they arrived, knowing when predators were near before Jed caught so much as a track in the mud. "Easy, boy," Jed murmured, though he found himself scanning the trees with the same wariness that had kept him alive in the jungles of Southeast Asia. Old habits died hard, and the woods taught you to trust your instincts above all else. If Scout was nervous, there was usually good reason for it. The forest seemed different today, though Jed couldn't put his finger on exactly how. The light filtered through the canopy in the same dappled patterns. The air carried the same sweet scent of pine and wood smoke from his morning fire. But there was something in the quality of the silence, a waiting quality that made the hair on the back of his neck stand on end. As they crested the ridge above the far meadow, Jed paused to catch his breath and survey the landscape below. The meadow spread before them like Sarah's favorite quilt, patches of wildflowers in purple and yellow and white, creating a tapestry of color against the green grass. But it was what lay beyond the meadow that caught his attention and held it fast. There, at the edge where the meadow met the deeper woods, something glinted in the morning sun. Something that hadn't been there before, something that had no business being there at all. Scout whined low in his throat, a sound of unease that Jed had learned to respect over their years together. "What do you make of that, old friend?" Jed whispered, his eyes fixed on the distant anomaly. From this distance, it looked like nothing more than a trick of light, a reflection off a puddle or perhaps a piece of quartz catching the sun. But something in his gut told him it was more than that. Something that would change the careful balance of his solitary life. The morning air suddenly felt charged with possibility, the way it did before a thunderstorm, and Jed found himself torn between curiosity and caution. Sarah used to say that life rarely gave second chances, that when opportunity knocked, you had to answer the door whether you felt ready or not. Standing there on the ridge above the meadow where they'd shared so many peaceful moments, Jed couldn't shake the feeling that she was trying to tell him something important. Scout pressed against his leg, seeking reassurance, and Jed reached down to scratch behind the dog's ears. Whatever waited for them in the meadow below, they would face it together, just as they had faced everything else in the years since Sarah's passing. The sun climbed higher in the sky, burning off the last of the morning mist, and the mysterious glint in the distance seemed to beckon with an almost magnetic pull. "Well, and boy," Jed said finally, his voice barely above a whisper, "reckon we've come this far. Might as well see what all the fuss is about." They started down the slope toward the meadow, each step taking them closer to something that would challenge everything Jed thought he knew about the nature of reality. Love, and the thin places where the world of the living touched something far more mysterious and profound. The descent into the meadow felt like stepping into a different world entirely. With each footfall, the familiar sounds of the forest seemed to grow more distant, as if the very air was thickening around them. Scout stayed close to Jed's heels, his usual enthusiasm for exploration replaced by a cautious alertness that set Jed's nerves on edge. As they drew closer to the source of the mysterious glint, Jed's breath caught in his throat. There, nestled between two massive cedar trees at the meadow's eastern edge, sat something that defied every law of nature he'd learned in his 63 years on this earth. A cabin perfect in every detail, but no bigger than the dollhouse Sarah's niece used to play with when she visited from the city. The structure couldn't have been more than 3 feet tall and perhaps 4 feet wide, yet it was complete in every impossible way. Tiny cedar shingles covered the roof in perfect rows, each one no bigger than a postage stamp. A stone chimney, impossibly thin but somehow functional, rose from the miniature roofline with actual smoke curling from its top. The smoke was real. Jed could smell the wood smoke on the air, sweet and familiar as his own morning fire. "Well, I'll be damned," he whispered, approaching the tiny structure with the same careful steps he'd used stalking a deer. Scout hung back, whimpering softly, his tail tucked between his legs in a way Jed had never seen before. The dog's instincts were screaming danger, but Jed felt something else entirely, a pull so strong it made his chest ache with longing. The cabin's front door, no bigger than his palm, was painted the same soft blue that Sarah had chosen for their own front door 20 years ago. She'd said blue brought peace, that it reminded her of clear skies and calm water. Beside the door hung a miniature lantern, its glass panels catching the afternoon light and casting tiny rainbows on the grass below. Jed circled the structure slowly, his trained eye taking in details that shouldn't have been possible. The windows were real glass, not plastic or some clever illusion. Through them, he could see the glow of what appeared to be a fire burning in an impossibly small fireplace. The porch railings were carved with the same intricate pattern he'd learned from his grandfather, each spindle perfect despite being no thicker than a pencil. "Scout, you seeing this too?" he asked, needing confirmation that he hadn't finally lost his grip on reality. The dog whined in response but refused to come closer, instead backing toward the tree line as if the very presence of the tiny cabin was an affront to the natural order. As Jed knelt before the miniature structure, his knees protesting against the damp ground, he noticed something that made his heart skip several beats. There, clearly visible through the tiny front window, was a rocking chair. Not just any rocking chair, but an exact replica of the one that had sat in their bedroom, the one Sarah had used during the long nights when the cancer kept sleep at bay. The chair was moving back and forth in a gentle rhythm, as if someone was sitting in it, though Jed could see no occupant. The motion was hypnotic, familiar, exactly the way Sarah used to rock when she was thinking through a problem, or simply enjoying the peace of evening settling over the mountains. Jed's hands trembled as he reached toward the tiny brass doorknob. Logic screamed at him to walk away, to chalk this up to altitude sickness or stress or some kind of elaborate hoax. But his heart knew better. This wasn't random or accidental. This was meant for him, specifically for him, in this place where he and Sarah had shared so many happy memories. "Sarah," he whispered, the name catching in his throat like a prayer. "Is that you in there, honey?" The rocking chair continued its gentle motion, and for just a moment Jed could swear he saw the faint outline of a figure seated in it. A woman with long, dark hair streaked with premature silver, wearing the faded blue dress Sarah had loved so much because he'd told her it matched her eyes. Scout's whimpering grew more urgent, and somewhere in the distance thunder rumbled despite the clear sky overhead. The air pressure seemed to be dropping, making Jed's ears pop, as if he were ascending to a much higher altitude. Everything in his logical mind told him to step away, to leave this impossible thing alone and return to the safety of his own cabin. Instead, he grasped the tiny doorknob between his thumb and forefinger. The brass was warm to the touch. warmer than it should have been given the cool mountain air. It felt real, solid, substantial despite its miniature size. As he turned it, Jed heard the soft click of a well-made latch, and the door swung open on hinges that moved without a sound. What he saw inside knocked him backward onto his heels, his breath coming in short gasps as his mind struggled to process the impossible. The cabin's interior wasn't proportioned to its tiny external dimensions. Instead, it opened into a space that seemed to stretch beyond physical limitations, like looking through a window into another world entirely. The rocking chair sat beside a fireplace that crackled with real flames, and in that chair, clear as daylight and solid as stone, sat Sarah. She looked exactly as she had in the months before the cancer took her hair, before the treatment stole the color from her cheeks. Her dark hair fell in loose waves around her shoulders, and she wore the blue dress he remembered so well. But it was her smile that undid him completely, that gentle, knowing smile that had been his anchor for 23 years of marriage. "Hello, Jed," she said, her voice carrying clearly despite the impossible acoustics of the situation. "I wondered when you'd finally find your way here." "This isn't real," Jed whispered, though his heart was racing with the hope he'd buried 5 years ago. "You're gone. I buried you. I put flowers on your grave every Sunday." Sarah's laugh was exactly as he remembered it, musical and warm. "Reality's a funny thing up here in the mountains, don't you think?" "Always has been. Remember that time we saw the mountain lion that couldn't have been there? Or the northern lights that appeared too far south for any scientist to explain?" She was right, of course. The mountains had always held mysteries, moments when the ordinary world seemed to thin and let glimpses of something larger peek through. But this was different. This was Sarah, his Sarah, sitting in a chair inside a cabin that couldn't exist. "I'm so sorry," he said, the words tumbling out in a rush of grief and guilt he'd carried for 5 long years. "I should have been there. I should have stayed home instead of chasing that damn elk. I should have—" "Hush now," Sarah interrupted, rising from the rocking chair with the same graceful movement he remembered. As she approached the tiny doorway, Jed realized he could see her with perfect clarity, despite the physical impossibility of the situation. "You were exactly where you needed to be, doing exactly what you needed to do. The mountains called you for a reason that day." "What reason?" Jed asked, though part of him was afraid to hear the answer. Sarah's hand appeared at the miniature doorway, somehow reaching beyond the confines of the tiny space to touch his cheek with fingers that felt warm and real and achingly familiar. "Because some lessons can only be learned when we're alone with our grief. Some strength can only be found in the depths of loss. And some gifts can only be received when we're finally ready to accept them." Thunder rumbled overhead again, closer this time, and Scout's barking grew more frantic. The afternoon light was fading faster than it should have, and Jed realized that whatever was happening here existed outside the normal flow of time and space. "I have to go," Sarah said, her hand beginning to fade even as he reached for it. "But this isn't goodbye, Jed. It's just the beginning. There are others here who've been waiting to see you, people who need your help before they can rest." "Wait," Jed called out. But the tiny door was already swinging shut, the warmth leaving the brass knob as normal physics reasserted itself. "Sarah, wait!" The cabin sat silent and still, looking for all the world like nothing more than an elaborate piece of folk art left by some eccentric woodcarver. The chimney no longer smoked, the windows showed only darkness within, and the rocking chair, when Jed peered through the tiny glass, sat motionless and empty. Scout bounded up to him then, his earlier fear replaced by concern for his master, who sat on the damp ground staring at a dollhouse and talking to empty air. But Jed barely noticed the dog's worried whines. His mind was reeling with the implications of what he'd just experienced, and his heart was singing with a joy he'd thought lost forever. Sarah was here. Somehow, impossibly, Sarah was here in these woods, and she wasn't alone. The first drops of rain began to fall as Jed finally stood, his knees protesting the movement. Storm clouds had gathered with unnatural speed, and the temperature was dropping fast. But as he turned to head back toward his cabin, the tiny brass doorknob caught the last rays of sunlight and winked at him like a promise. He would be back. Whatever this was, wherever it led, he would be back. The storm that followed Jed home was unlike any he'd seen in 30 years of mountain living. Rain fell in sheets so thick he could barely see Scout trotting ahead of him on the familiar trail. Lightning split the sky with unnatural frequency, and the thunder that followed seemed to roll on forever, echoing off the canyon walls in a symphony of impossible reverberations. By the time they reached the cabin, both man and dog were soaked to the bone. Jed's hands shook as he fumbled with the door latch, and he couldn't tell if it was from the cold rain or the aftershock of what he'd witnessed in the meadow. Scout bounded inside the moment the door opened, shaking water from his coat and heading straight for the warmth of the fireplace. "Easy, boy," Jed murmured, though his own movements were just as urgent as he stripped off his wet clothes and pulled on dry wool. The familiar routine of building up the fire should have been comforting, but his hands continued to tremble as he fed kindling to the flames. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Sarah's face, heard her voice, felt the impossible warmth of her touch on his cheek, the rational part of his mind, the part that had kept him alive through 3 tours in Vietnam and 40 years of wilderness living, insisted he'd suffered some kind of breakdown. Hallucinations brought on by stress, isolation, maybe a small stroke that had gone unnoticed. Men his age were prone to such things, especially men who lived alone with nothing but memories for company. But the Sarah he'd seen wasn't a product of wishful thinking or failing mental health. She'd been real in ways that transcended physical presence. Her laugh, the way she tilted her head when she was making a point, the exact shade of blue in her eyes, every detail had been perfect, more vivid than his best memories of her. As the fire caught and began to warm the cabin, Jed pulled Sarah's rocking chair closer to the hearth and settled into it with a heavy sigh. The chair creaked under his weight, a sound that had become as familiar as his own breathing. But tonight, the sound carried an added significance. It was the same rhythm he'd heard in that impossible tiny cabin, the same gentle back-and-forth motion that had drawn him to open that miniature door. Scout padded over and laid his head on Jed's knee, brown eyes full of concern. The dog had been unusually quiet since they'd returned home. None of his usual post-storm energy or excitement about being warm and dry. Instead, he seemed to be studying his master with an intensity that made Jed uncomfortable. "You saw her too, didn't you, boy?" Jed asked, scratching behind Scout's ears. "That's why you were so spooked. You knew something was different about that place." Scout's tail thumped once against the floor, and Jed took that as confirmation. Animals had always been more sensitive to supernatural phenomena than humans. Every mountain man worth his salt knew that. If Scout had sensed something otherworldly about the tiny cabin, then Jed's experience was more than just the product of a grieving mind. The storm raged outside for hours, wind howling through the trees, with a voice that sounded almost human. More than once, Jed thought he heard his name being called on the wind, but when he pressed his face to the window, he saw nothing but darkness and rain. Lightning illuminated the forest in stark black and white snapshots, revealing trees bent nearly horizontal by the wind and streams that had become rushing torrents. It was past midnight when the storm finally began to subside, leaving behind the steady patter of gentle rain and the occasional rumble of distant thunder. Jed had dozed fitfully in the rocking chair, dreams filled with tiny doors and impossible spaces, and Sarah's voice calling to him from just beyond his reach. Each time he woke, he found Scout watching him with those same concerned eyes, as if the dog was keeping vigil. "Can't sleep either, huh?" Jed murmured, and Scout's tail wagged once in response. The truth was, Jed was afraid to sleep. Afraid that when he woke, the memory of seeing Sarah would fade like morning mist, becoming just another cruel trick his lonely mind had played on him. But he was also afraid that it wouldn't fade, that he'd wake knowing with absolute certainty that something impossible had happened in that meadow. something that challenged everything he thought he knew about the nature of life and death. Sarah had said there were others waiting, people who needed his help before they could rest. The implications of that statement sat in his stomach like a cold stone. If Sarah was somehow still present in these mountains, trapped between worlds, what did that mean for all the other souls who had died in this vast wilderness over the centuries? The mountains had seen their share of tragedy over the years. Native American battles, pioneer disasters, mining accidents, hunting mishaps. The forest was filled with graves, both marked and unmarked. Jed had found old bones during his wanderings, artifacts of lives cut short by the harsh realities of mountain living. He'd always treated such discoveries with respect, but he'd never considered that some of those souls might still be present, waiting for something only he could provide. As dawn approached, painting the eastern sky with pale fingers of light, Jed made a decision that would have seemed insane 24 hours earlier. He was going back to the meadow, not because he was certain about what he'd experienced, but because he couldn't live with the uncertainty. If there was even a chance that Sarah was somehow still reachable, still in need of something from him, then he had to pursue it. Scout seemed to sense his master's resolve and padded over to his food bowl, looking back at Jed expectantly. The routine of morning chores felt surreal after the night's revelations, but life had a way of demanding attention regardless of supernatural encounters. Jed fed the dog, banked the fire, and prepared a simple breakfast that he barely tasted. The rain had stopped completely by the time he stepped outside, leaving the forest washed clean and smelling of pine and wet earth. Everything looked exactly as it had for 20 years of mornings, but now Jed saw it with different eyes. Every shadow might hide mysteries. Every rustle in the underbrush might signal something beyond the ordinary world of wildlife and weather. The walk to the meadow felt different in daylight. Yesterday's sense of anticipation had been replaced by a mixture of dread and hope that made his chest tight. Scout trotted beside him, no longer afraid, but clearly alert to possibilities that existed beyond normal canine experience. The dog's senses would be crucial if the tiny cabin was still there. If yesterday hadn't been an elaborate hallucination, Scout would know before Jed saw anything. As they crested the ridge above the meadow, Jed's heart hammered against his ribs. The wildflowers still painted the grass in brilliant colors, and the morning sun still slanted through the trees at the same familiar angle. But there, at the meadow's edge, where it met the deeper woods, sat proof that yesterday's impossible encounter had been real. The tiny cabin waited for him, its miniature chimney once again sending a thin curl of smoke into the morning air. The approach to the tiny cabin felt like walking through increasingly thick air, each step requiring more effort than the last. Scout stayed close this time, his earlier fear replaced by a protective alertness that Jed found oddly comforting. Whatever supernatural forces were at work here, his faithful companion had apparently decided they were something to be guarded against rather than fled from. The cabin looked exactly as it had the day before, down to the last tiny shingle and the impossibly thin curl of smoke rising from its miniature chimney. But now Jed noticed details he'd missed in yesterday's shock and wonder. A small garden plot beside the structure, complete with vegetables no bigger than his pinky nail. A woodpile stacked with logs thin as matchsticks. Even a tiny rain barrel positioned to catch water from the dollhouse gutters. "Well, I'll be," he murmured, kneeling to examine the miniature garden more closely. The vegetables were real. He could see tiny tomatoes the size of peppercorns, lettuce leaves smaller than his thumbnails, bean plants that twisted up stakes no thicker than toothpicks. Everything was perfectly proportioned, as if some master craftsman had spent years creating the most detailed dollhouse imaginable. But it wasn't a dollhouse. The smell of wood smoke was real. The steam rising from the tiny chimney was genuine, and when Jed pressed his ear close to the structure, he could swear he heard the faint crackle of a fire within. This time, when he grasped the miniature brass doorknob, he was prepared for the impossible. The door swung open on its silent hinges, revealing the same expanded interior space that had shocked him the day before. But now, the tiny front room was occupied by more than just Sarah. An elderly man sat in a rocking chair near the fireplace, his weathered hands folded in his lap and his eyes closed as if he were napping. He wore the faded uniform of a Union soldier, complete with brass buttons that caught the firelight. Beside him on a small table lay a tattered letter, its edges yellow with age. "That's Henry Morrison." Sarah's voice came from somewhere deeper in the impossible space. "He's been waiting here for 60 years, hoping someone would deliver his last letter home." Jed's vision seemed to expand, allowing him to see farther into the tiny cabin's interior than should have been possible. Sarah emerged from what appeared to be a kitchen area, wiping her hands on an apron he recognized from their early married years. Behind her, other figures moved in the shadows, men and women in clothing from different eras, all wearing expressions of patient waiting. "How many are there?" Jed asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "More than you might expect," Sarah replied, settling into her own rocking chair beside the sleeping soldier. "This is a crossing place, Jed. Has been for longer than anyone can remember. Some souls get lost on their way to whatever comes next. They end up here, waiting for someone who can help them finish their earthly business." The old soldier stirred at the sound of voices, opening eyes that were clouded with cataracts, but still held a spark of intelligence. When he saw Jed peering through the tiny doorway, his face lit up with hope. "Are you the one?" Henry asked, his voice carrying a slight Irish accent. "The one who can take my letter to Boston? I promised my Mary I'd write, but the fever took me before I could send it proper." Jed found himself nodding before he fully understood what he was agreeing to. "Where in Boston?" Henry's gnarled hand trembled as he picked up the letter from the table. "Beacon Hill, number 47 Louisburg Square. Mary Morrison, that's my wife. Was my wife. Lord knows if she's still there after all these years, but I made a promise." "Henry," Sarah said gently, "it's been more than 60 years since Gettysburg. Your Mary has been waiting for you on the other side for decades." The old soldier's face crumpled with the weight of realization, but then he straightened with military bearing. "Then the letter's even more important, isn't it? Someone needs to know I kept my word, that I tried to come home. Maybe her great-grandchildren, or someone who tends her grave. A man's word should mean something, even in death." Jed felt a familiar tug in his chest, the same instinct that had driven him to help stranded travelers and lost hikers throughout his years in the mountains. "How do I take it?" "The letter's as small as everything else in there." Sarah smiled, the expression lighting up her entire face. "Touch it, Jed, that's all you have to do. Touch it with the intention to help, and it becomes what it needs to be in your world." Jed reached through the impossible space of the tiny doorway, his fingers brushing against the miniature letter. The moment his skin made contact with the aged paper, he felt a warmth spread up his arm, and suddenly he was holding a full-sized envelope, sealed with red wax and addressed in a careful hand to Mrs. Mary Morrison, 47 Louisburg Square, Boston, Massachusetts. Henry Morrison smiled with relief so profound it seemed to transform his entire being. "Bless you, son. You've lifted a burden I've carried since Lincoln was president." As Jed watched, the old soldier began to fade, becoming translucent like morning mist. But his smile remained bright until the very last moment, when he disappeared entirely, leaving only an empty rocking chair and the lingering scent of tobacco and leather. "He's at peace now," Sarah said softly. "Free to find his Mary and continue their journey together. Are they all like that?" Jed asked, looking at the other shadowy figures moving in the cabin's depths, all carrying some unfinished business. "Each one has something different," Sarah replied. "A message to deliver, a wrong to set right, a truth to reveal. They can't move on until someone from the living world helps them complete what they started." Jed studied the letter in his hands, feeling the weight of responsibility that came with it. Boston was 1,000 miles away, a journey that would take him farther from these mountains than he'd traveled in 20 years. But looking at Sarah's encouraging smile, he knew he couldn't refuse. "There are others," she continued, "closer to home. A child who was lost in these woods during the gold rush, still trying to find her way back to her family's camp. A young couple who died in an avalanche, leaving behind a treasure they hid for their unborn child. A native medicine man who needs his sacred bundle returned to his people's burial ground. Scout whined softly, pressing against Jed's leg as if sensing the magnitude of what was being asked. The dog's warmth was reassuring, a reminder of the solid, everyday world that still existed beyond this supernatural convergence. "Why me?" Jed asked. "Why am I the one who can see this place, who can help them?" Sarah's expression grew tender, the same look she used to give him when he was struggling with memories from the war. "Because you understand loss, Jed. You know what it means to be separated from the ones you love. And because you've always had a good heart, even when you couldn't see it yourself." The letter in Jed's hands seemed to pulse with its own life, as if the emotions contained within were still fresh after 6 decades of waiting. He carefully tucked it into his jacket pocket, already planning the journey to Boston that would take him away from these mountains for the first time since Sarah's funeral. "I'll help them," he said simply. "All of them. Whatever they need." Sarah's smile was radiant with love and pride. "I knew you would. But be careful, Jed. The living world and this place don't always play well together. And there are some who would use these lost souls for their own purposes if they knew how to find them." The journey to Boston took Jed 3 days of hard travel, each mile taking him further from the mountains that had been his sanctuary for 20 years. The letter rested safely in his jacket pocket, its weight seeming to increase with every passing hour, as if the responsibility it carried was becoming more real with distance from the supernatural crossing place. Scout rode beside him in the passenger seat of his old pickup truck, ears perked and eyes alert to the changing landscape outside the windows. The dog had never been this far from home, and Jed could sense his companion's unease with the increasing noise and bustle as they approached the East Coast. Truth be told, Jed felt much the same way. The crowded highways and towering buildings felt like an assault on senses. Accustomed to wilderness silence, Boston's Beacon Hill neighborhood was exactly as Jed had imagined, from Henry Morrison's descriptions, though the soldiers' memories were from a different century entirely. Narrow cobblestone streets wound between elegant brownstones, their brick facades weathered by time, but still maintaining an air of quiet dignity. Gas lamps lined the sidewalks, and small gardens tucked behind wrought iron fences added splashes of color to the urban landscape. Finding 47 Louisburg Square proved easier than expected. The address led to a well-maintained brownstone with window boxes full of late summer flowers and a brass nameplate beside the front door. But the name engraved there wasn't Morrison, it read Whitfield Family Trust, with smaller text indicating the building served as a historical society dedicated to preserving Civil War correspondence. Jed stood on the sidewalk for several minutes, Henry's letter growing warm in his pocket, as if responding to proximity to its intended destination. A small plaque beside the door caught his attention. This building once housed the Morrison family letters collection, donated in 1924 by the estate of Mary Morrison, who preserved over 300 letters from her husband Henry. Killed at Gettysburg in 1863, the irony wasn't lost on him. Mary Morrison had spent 60 years collecting and preserving letters from her husband, never knowing that one final message was waiting in a supernatural crossing place deep in the Montana wilderness. She had died still, hoping for one last word from the man she'd loved, while Henry had died trying to send it. The director of the Historical Society, a kind woman named Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell, listened to Jed's story with the patience of someone accustomed to unusual requests from family historians and genealogy enthusiasts. She didn't seem entirely convinced by his explanation of finding the letter in a deceased relative's effects, but the physical evidence spoke for itself. The paper was clearly aged, the ink faded to the brown of old blood, and the wax seal bore the distinctive mark of Henry's Union Regiment. "This is extraordinary," Dr. Hartwell whispered as she examined the letter under a magnifying glass. "The handwriting matches perfectly with the other Morrison letters in our collection. But how could this have survived when our records show that Mary Morrison received his final letter in October of 1863? Maybe it got lost in the mail system," Jed suggested, though the explanation felt hollow even to him. "The war disrupted a lot of communications." Dr. Hartwell carefully opened the letter, revealing 3 pages of cramped handwriting that spoke of love and longing and the terrible reality of battlefield life. The final paragraph brought tears to her eyes. "My dearest Mary, if you are reading this, then God has seen fit to carry my words home, even if I cannot come myself. Know that my last thoughts were of you, and that whatever awaits beyond this life, I will find a way to be with you again. Your devoted husband, Henry." "We'll add this to the Morrison collection immediately," Dr. Hartwell said, wiping her eyes with a tissue, "and we'll make sure it's displayed prominently." Mary Morrison died believing her husband's last words had been lost forever. "In a way, you've reunited them after 160 years. Walking back to his truck, Jed felt a lightness in his chest that he hadn't experienced since Sarah's death. Henry Morrison was at peace, reunited with his beloved Mary in whatever realm awaited beyond the crossing place. The mission felt complete, in a way that satisfied something deep in Jed's soul, the knowledge that love could transcend even death when given the right assistance. But as he drove away from Boston, heading back toward the mountains that called to him like a siren song, Jed couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Cars seemed to follow him for longer than coincidence would suggest, and more than once he caught glimpses of the same black sedan in his rearview mirror. When he stopped for gas or food, he noticed men in expensive suits who seemed out of place in roadside diners and truck stops. Scout sensed his master's unease and became increasingly protective as they traveled west. The dog's hackles would rise whenever they encountered the mysterious watchers, and his low growls served as an early warning system that kept Jed alert to potential threats. On the second night of their return journey, camped in a rest area outside of Denver, Jed finally got confirmation that his paranoia was justified. A man approached their campsite after midnight, moving with the careful precision of someone trained in military or law enforcement tactics. He was young, maybe 35, with the kind of soft hands and expensive clothes that suggested government work rather than outdoor living. "Mr. Harlan," the man said, stopping just outside the circle of light cast by Jed's campfire. "My name is Agent Carlyle. I represent certain parties who are very interested in your recent activities." Scout growled low in his throat, positioning himself between Jed and the stranger. Jed's hand moved instinctively to the hunting knife on his belt, though he kept his voice calm and measured. "Don't know what you mean, friend. Just heading home from visiting family back east." The Whitfield Historical Society contacted the FBI about an unusual Civil War letter that appeared in their collection yesterday, Carlyle continued, apparently unfazed by Scout's threatening posture. A letter that, according to their experts, couldn't possibly exist given the known historical record. They're calling it either an incredibly sophisticated forgery or something that challenges our understanding of linear time. Jed felt his blood turn cold. He'd underestimated how much attention Henry's letter would attract, focused as he was on completing the dead soldier's mission rather than considering the wider implications of supernatural artifacts appearing in the modern world. "People lose things all the time," Jed said carefully. "Sometimes they turn up in the strangest places years later." Agent Carlyle stepped closer to the fire, revealing a face that was younger than his voice suggested, but marked by the kind of stress that came with knowledge of things beyond normal experience. "Mr. Harlan, we know about the anomalous energy readings detected in the Timbervale woods over the past week. We know about the meteorological disturbances that don't match any known weather patterns. And we know that you were in that area when these phenomena began manifesting." The agent pulled out a tablet and showed Jed satellite images of his own mountains. false color overlays highlighting areas of unusual electromagnetic activity. The readings were concentrated exactly where the tiny cabin sat in its impossible meadow. A bright spot of energy that pulsed like a heartbeat on the digital display. There are others who are aware of these phenomena, Carlyle continued, his voice dropping to a whisper. Others who wouldn't hesitate to use whatever you've discovered for purposes that have nothing to do with helping lost souls find peace. We'd like to offer you protection, Mr. Harlan, in exchange for cooperation with our investigation. Jed studied the young agent's face, seeing genuine concern beneath the official facade. But he also saw ambition, the hunger for answers that could make a career or justify a budget. This man wasn't evil, but he represented forces that would turn the crossing place into a laboratory, would cage the lost souls like specimens to be studied and exploited. I appreciate the offer, Jed said finally, but I think I'll stick to minding my own business. These mountains have a way of protecting themselves from folks who don't belong. Agent Carlyle nodded slowly, as if he'd expected that response. Think carefully, Mr. Harlan. There are worse things than government oversight. Private interests who would kill to control what you found. Religious extremists who would destroy it rather than let it challenge their beliefs. We might be your only chance to keep whatever's happening in those woods from being corrupted or eliminated entirely. With that ominous warning, the agent melted back into the darkness beyond the firelight, leaving Jed alone with his thoughts and a growing sense that his simple mission of mercy had drawn attention from forces far more dangerous than he'd imagined. Jed drove through the night after Agent Carlyle's visit, pushing hard to reach the familiar territory of his mountains before dawn. Scout slept fitfully in the passenger seat, occasionally whimpering at dreams that might have been memories of the strange men who'd been following them. The dog's unease matched Jed's own growing sense that their simple life of solitude had been shattered beyond repair. The Timbervale woods welcomed them home with the sweet scent of pine and the soft whisper of wind through ancient branches. But even here, Jed couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Satellite imagery didn't lie. If the government could detect energy readings from the crossing place, then the tiny cabin's supernatural presence was affecting the physical world in measurable ways. How long before that attracted more attention than one young agent with offers of protection? The sun was rising over the eastern peaks when Jed finally pulled into the clearing where his cabin had stood for 20 years. Everything looked exactly as he'd left it, but now he saw potential vulnerabilities everywhere. The dirt road that provided access could easily accommodate government vehicles. The open clearing would be visible from aerial surveillance. The cabin itself, built for comfort rather than defense, offered no protection against determined intruders. Sarah's voice seemed to whisper on the morning breeze. Some who would use these lost souls for their own purposes. She'd warned him about this danger, but Jed had been too focused on Henry Morrison's letter to consider the wider implications. Now he was beginning to understand that his role as helper to the supernatural, Crossing Place, came with responsibilities that extended far beyond simple errands of mercy. After securing the cabin and ensuring Scout had fresh water and food, Jed set out for the meadow where the tiny cabin waited. The journey felt different now, weighted with knowledge of external threats and the certainty that his actions were being monitored by forces beyond his understanding. Every rustle in the underbrush might signal human watchers rather than wildlife. Every bird call might mask electronic surveillance equipment. But when he crested the ridge above the meadow, all such concerns faded into insignificance. The tiny cabin sat where it always had, smoke curling from its miniature chimney, but now it was surrounded by other structures just as impossible and just as real. A small village had grown up around the original cabin overnight, tiny houses, shops, even what appeared to be a church with a steeple no bigger than a pencil. "Welcome back," Sarah's voice called from the doorway of the original cabin. She emerged wearing a different dress now, one Jed recognized from their courting days, and her smile carried a mixture of pride and concern. "You did beautifully with Henry. He found Mary waiting for him just as we hoped." There are more of them, Jed observed, indicating the expanded village of miniature structures. A lot more. Word spreads quickly among the lost, Sarah explained, leading him to a tiny bench that appeared just the right size for him to sit on, despite its dollhouse proportions. When one soul finds peace through your help, others are drawn to this crossing place. They've been waiting scattered across time and space for someone who could bridge the gap between their world and yours. Jed settled onto the impossible bench, feeling it support his full weight, despite its miniature size. Around him, the tiny village bustled with activity as translucent figures moved between the buildings, going about the business of existence in whatever realm they inhabited. He could see children playing in a park no bigger than his palm, vendors selling goods from stalls the size of matchboxes, and couples walking hand in hand down streets narrow as pencils. How many? He asked, though part of him was afraid to hear the answer. In this immediate area, perhaps 200 souls spanning 3 centuries, Sarah replied. But there are other crossing places, Jed. Dozens of them scattered across these mountains, each one holding its own collection of the lost and waiting. You've awakened something that's been dormant for decades. A chill ran down Jed's spine as he considered the implications. If Agent Carlyle could detect energy readings from this single crossing place, what would happen when dozens of similar sites began manifesting supernatural activity? The government attention he'd already attracted would seem like a minor inconvenience compared to the forces that would mobilize to control or destroy such phenomena. There's something else, Sarah continued, her expression growing troubled. The attention you've drawn from the living world has attracted notice from other entities as well. Things that feed on spiritual energy that would consume these lost souls if given the chance. As if summoned by her words, the temperature in the meadow dropped 20 degrees in an instant. The tiny village's inhabitants stopped their activities and looked up with expressions of fear, pointing toward the tree line where shadows seemed to be moving independently of any natural light source. Scout, who had been exploring the edge of the meadow, came running back to Jed's side with his hackles raised and a growl rumbling deep in his chest. "What are they?" Jed asked, his hand moving instinctively to the knife on his belt, even though he suspected conventional weapons would be useless against whatever was approaching. "Soul feeders," Sarah whispered, her form becoming less solid, as if the creature's very presence weakened her connection to this realm. "They've been drawn by the energy signature of the crossing place, magnified by your successful mission to Boston. They want to harvest the spiritual essence of everyone trapped here." The shadows at the tree line coalesced into shapes that hurt to look at directly. Tall, elongated figures that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. They moved with a predatory grace that reminded Jed of wolves circling a wounded deer, but there was an intelligence in their movements that spoke of purpose beyond mere hunger. "How do I fight them?" Jed demanded, rising from the tiny bench and positioning himself between the approaching entities and the miniature village. "You can't," Sarah said, her voice growing fainter. "Not directly. But there's something. An artifact hidden in these mountains by a medicine man named Running Bear. He was the first guardian of this crossing place, centuries before you arrived. His sacred bundle contains tools that can protect the lost souls from creatures like these." One of the shadow entities let out a sound that was part scream and part static, a noise that made Jed's teeth ache and sent Scout cowering behind his legs. The creature was testing the boundaries of the crossing place, probing for weaknesses in whatever supernatural barriers protected the tiny village. "Where?" Jed asked urgently. "Where did Running Bear hide his bundle?" "The sacred cave behind Weeping Falls," Sarah replied, her form now barely visible against the morning light. "But hurry, Jed. These creatures grow stronger with each passing moment, and once they breach the crossing place's defenses," her words were cut off, as the lead shadow entity let out another of its terrible cries and began advancing toward the tiny village. The miniature inhabitants scattered in panic, seeking shelter in buildings that suddenly seemed far too fragile to offer any real protection. Whatever barriers had kept such creatures at bay for centuries were failing. weakened by the increased supernatural activity that Jed's missions had generated. Without hesitation, Jed turned and ran toward the tree line, Scout close behind him. If Running Bear's sacred bundle held the key to protecting the crossing place, then finding it became his top priority. But as he plunged into the forest, he could hear the soul feeder's cries growing louder behind him, and he knew that time was running out for the 200 lost souls who depended on him for protection. The hunt for the sacred cave would have to be the fastest tracking job of his life, because failure would mean watching helplessly as creatures from nightmare consumed the spirits of everyone he'd sworn to help, including Sarah. Weeping Falls lay 12 miles deeper into the Timbervale woods, accessible only by a treacherous game trail that wound through some of the most remote wilderness in Montana. Jed had been there twice in 20 years, both times while tracking wounded animals that had fled deep into the forest. The falls got their name from the way water seeped through limestone cracks above the main cascade, creating the illusion of tears streaming down the rock face. Scout ran ahead on the narrow trail, his nose working frantically to sort through the complex scents of the deep forest. But there was something different about the dog's behavior. Instead of the usual enthusiasm for exploration, he moved with the focused intensity of an animal tracking specific prey. Every few hundred yards, he would stop and look back at Jed with an expression that seemed almost human in its urgency. The forest itself felt different as they penetrated deeper into its heart. The usual sounds of wildlife had ceased entirely, replaced by an oppressive silence that made every footfall seem unnaturally loud. Even the wind had stilled, leaving the trees motionless as monuments in a cemetery. It was as if the entire ecosystem was holding its breath, waiting for some cosmic shoe to drop. 3 hours into their desperate journey, Scout suddenly veered off the main trail and began climbing a steep slope covered in loose shale and fallen timber. Jed followed, trusting his companion's instincts, even though this route would take them nowhere near Weeping Falls. The dog seemed to know exactly where he was going, following scent trails invisible to human senses, but apparently clear as highway signs to his enhanced perception. They climbed for another hour before Scout stopped at the entrance to a cave Jed had never seen before. Despite his intimate knowledge of these mountains, the opening was partially concealed by a rockfall that looked natural, but had been carefully arranged to hide the entrance from casual observers. Ancient symbols were carved into the stone above the opening, weathered by centuries but still recognizable as Native American pictographs. "This isn't Weeping Falls," Jed muttered. But Scout was already disappearing into the cave's dark mouth, his tail wagging for the first time since they'd encountered the soul feeders. Whatever the dog had been tracking, it led into this hidden chamber rather than the location Sarah had specified. Jed pulled out his flashlight and followed Scout into the cave, ducking low to avoid the rocky ceiling. The passage angled downward for 30 feet before opening into a circular chamber that took his breath away. The walls were covered in pictographs depicting scenes of supernatural encounters, tiny figures emerging from cave openings, shadow creatures being driven back by warriors carrying sacred objects, and souls ascending toward a stylized representation of the afterlife. At the center of the chamber sat a figure that made Jed's heart skip several beats. An elderly Native American man in traditional dress, seated cross-legged before a small fire that cast dancing shadows on the painted walls. His long white hair was braided with feathers and beads, and his weathered face bore the kind of peace that came only with great wisdom and acceptance of life's mysteries. "You're early," the man said, without looking up from the fire. His voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed, but there was warmth in it as well. "I expected you to follow the white woman's directions to Weeping Falls first." "You're Running Bear," Jed said, though it wasn't really a question. The man's presence radiated the same supernatural energy as the tiny village, confirming that he existed in the same liminal space between life and death. "I am," Running Bear replied, finally raising his eyes to meet Jed's gaze. And you are the mountain man who has awakened the crossing places after decades of slumber. Your dog knew the truth even if your heart did not. The sacred bundle was never hidden at Weeping Falls. Scout trotted over to the elderly shaman and laid his head on the man's knee, tail wagging as if greeting an old friend. Running Bear scratched behind the dog's ears with the casual familiarity of a long relationship. "I don't understand," Jed said, settling cross-legged across the fire from Running Bear. Sarah told you what she believed to be true," Running Bear interrupted gently. "But there are layers to this mystery that even she doesn't fully comprehend. The sacred bundle was never hidden because it was never lost. I have been its guardian for 300 years, waiting for the right person to pass its responsibilities to." The shaman reached into a leather pouch at his side and withdrew an object that made Jed's breath catch. It was a medicine bundle wrapped in ancient deer hide and bound with sinew, but it pulsed with its own inner light. Symbols stitched into the leather seemed to move in the firelight, shifting and changing like living things. "The soul feeders you encountered are not random predators," Running Bear continued, holding the bundle reverently in both hands. "They are servants of something much older and more dangerous, something that has been trying to breach the barriers between worlds for centuries." As if summoned by his words, the temperature in the cave dropped precipitously. The fire flickered and nearly went out, and somewhere in the darkness beyond the chamber, something howled with a voice like grinding stone. Scout whimpered and pressed closer to Running Bear, who began singing in a language that predated European contact with the Americas. "It's here," Running Bear said, his song faltering for a moment. "The thing that commands the soul feeders. I had hoped your awakening of the crossing places would draw it out into the open, where it could be confronted. But I didn't expect it to arrive so quickly." The howling grew louder, echoing through the cave system with a sound that seemed to bypass the ears and resonate directly in the bones. This wasn't one of the shadow entities Jed had seen at the meadow. This was their master, something so fundamentally wrong that its very presence made reality struggle to contain it. "What is it?" Jed asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. "A wound," Running Bear replied, his eyes reflecting the firelight like an animal's, a tear in the fabric of existence itself, caused by a ritual that went wrong during the cavalry wars. White soldiers and native warriors died together in such numbers and with such hatred that they punched a hole through to somewhere else. Something crawled through that hole and has been trying to widen it ever since. The shaman stood with fluid grace despite his apparent age, holding the sacred bundle out to Jed. "This contains the tools needed to heal that wound. But it requires someone with connections to both worlds, the living and the dead, the natural and the supernatural. Someone who has lost enough to understand death, but retained enough love to value life." Jed reached for the bundle, feeling its weight settle into his hands like destiny itself. The moment his fingers closed around the ancient leather, images flooded his mind, visions of the battle that had created the wound, of the entity that had crawled through from whatever nightmare dimension lay beyond, of the terrible hunger that drove it to consume spiritual energy. "Sarah knows," he gasped, understanding flooding through him like cold water. "She's been trying to gather enough souls at the crossing place to perform the healing ritual. That's why she needed me to help them, not just for their individual peace, but to create enough combined spiritual energy to seal the wound permanently." Running Bear smiled with satisfaction. "Now you begin to understand. But the ritual requires a sacrifice. Someone must remain on the other side of the wound to seal it from within. Sarah has been preparing for that role, but she cannot complete it alone." The howling reached a crescendo that made the cave walls tremble, and dust began falling from the ceiling like a stone rain. Whatever entity commanded the soul feeders was directly above them now, sensing the presence of the sacred bundle and the threat it represented to its plans for dimensional conquest. "We need to get back to the crossing place," Jed said, clutching the bundle to his chest. If Sarah's gathering souls for a healing ritual, she'll need protection while she prepares. Yes, Running Bear agreed, gathering up his few possessions with practiced efficiency. But understand this, Mountain Man, the ritual will require more than just spiritual energy. It will require someone with feet in both worlds to anchor the healing from this side while Sarah works from within the wound itself. As they prepared to leave the cave, Jed realized with crystalline clarity what Running Bear was telling him. The healing ritual would separate him from Sarah forever, trapping her on the other side of a sealed dimensional barrier while he remained in the world of the living. He would save the crossing place and protect the lost souls. But the price would be losing Sarah all over again, this time by his own choice. The entity above them let out another howl that sounded almost like laughter, as if it understood the cruel irony of the situation. To save the woman he loved, Jed would have to condemn himself to an eternity without her. The journey back to the crossing place took on the urgency of a military retreat, with the sound of the ancient entity crashing through the forest behind them like a landslide given malevolent purpose. Running Bear moved with surprising speed for his apparent age, his moccasined feet finding purchase on slopes that would challenge a mountain goat. Scout ranged ahead, but kept looking back with worried eyes, as if he could sense the cosmic wrongness pursuing them through the trees. Jed clutched the sacred bundle to his chest, feeling its power pulse in rhythm with his heartbeat. The leather wrapping had grown warm against his body, and the symbols stitched into its surface seemed to glow with their own inner light. Images continued to flash through his mind, fragments of the ritual Running Bear expected him to perform. Glimpses of the dimensional wound that had been festering in these mountains for over a century. "Tell me about the cavalry battle," Jed called out as they descended a particularly treacherous slope. Understanding the enemy was the first rule of warfare, and whatever they were about to face had been born from that long-ago conflict. 1876, Running Bear replied without breaking stride. "Colonel Morrison and 300 cavalry surrounded my people at the sacred springs, where the crossing places have always been strongest. We had women and children there, performing the seasonal rituals that kept the barriers between worlds intact." The name Morrison hit Jed like a physical blow. Henry Morrison's ancestor? His great-uncle. A man consumed by hatred for my people, willing to attack during sacred ceremonies because he knew we would be vulnerable. Running Bear's voice carried the weight of old grief, mixed with understanding. Both sides fought with desperation born of generations of conflict. When the battle ended, 600 souls had died violently on ground that was already thin between dimensions. They crested a ridge and could see the meadow in the distance. But what they saw there made Jed's blood run cold. The tiny village that had grown around Sarah's cabin was under siege. Shadow entities swarmed around the miniature buildings like ants attacking a picnic, their forms becoming more solid and defined with each passing moment. The soul feeders were no longer testing the crossing place's defenses, they were actively breaching them. But worse than the shadow creatures was what loomed above the meadow itself. A tear in the very air hung like a wound in reality, its edges crackling with energy that hurt to look at directly. Through that dimensional rift, Jed could see movement, things that belonged to no earthly ecosystem pressing against the barrier, trying to force their way through into the world of the living. "The wound is opening," Running Bear observed with grim satisfaction. "The master entity has grown tired of working through servants. It means to enter our realm directly." In the meadow below, Sarah's form flickered in and out of visibility as she moved between the tiny buildings, gathering the lost souls into the central cabin. Her voice carried on the wind, singing something that sounded like a hymn crossed with a war chant. The other spirits followed her lead, their translucent forms beginning to glow with the same inner light as the sacred bundle. "She's beginning the ritual," Jed realized, watching Sarah orchestrate the supernatural gathering. "But she can't complete it without the bundle, and she cannot survive it without an anchor on this side," Running Bear added. "The healing will require her to enter the wound itself to become part of the seal." Once that process begins, only someone with strong connections to both worlds can call her back or choose to let her go. They began their descent toward the meadow, but Agent Carlyle's black sedan burst from the tree line, followed by 2 more government vehicles filled with men in tactical gear. The agents spread out around the meadow's perimeter, setting up equipment that Jed didn't recognize, but which hummed with electronic purpose. Electromagnetic field generators, Running Bear identified with distaste. They mean to contain the phenomenon, study it. They do not understand that some things should not be caged. The lead agent stepped forward with a bullhorn, his voice echoing across the supernatural battlefield. This is Agent Carlyle, Federal Bureau of Investigation. This area is now under government jurisdiction. All personnel are ordered to evacuate immediately. One of the shadow entities turned its attention from the tiny village to the government forces, flowing across the meadow grass like spilled oil. When it reached the perimeter where the agents had set up their equipment, it passed through the electromagnetic barriers as if they were made of air. The agent operating the nearest field generator screamed as the creature enveloped him, his life force visibly draining away until only a withered husk remained inside his tactical gear. "Fall back," Carlyle shouted, but his remaining agents were already in full retreat. Whatever training they'd received for dealing with supernatural phenomena clearly hadn't covered entities that could drain life energy through physical contact. The distraction gave Jed and Running Bear the opening they needed to reach the edge of the meadow undetected. Up close, the damage to the crossing place was even more severe than it had appeared from the ridge. Several of the tiny buildings had been torn apart by the shadow entity's assault, their miniature inhabitants huddled in the remaining structures. The dimensional rift above them continued to widen, and things that defied description pressed against its edges with increasing desperation. "Jed!" Sarah's voice called out, her form solidifying as she saw him approaching with the sacred bundle. "Thank the spirits you found Running Bear?" "I found him," Jed replied, though the medicine man's presence raised as many questions as it answered. "But Sarah, he says the ritual will trap you on the other side. There has to be another way." Sarah's smile was achingly beautiful and infinitely sad. "There is no other way, my love. The wound has been growing for over a century, fed by the hatred and violence that created it. Only a willing sacrifice can provide enough spiritual energy to heal something that massive." Running Bear stepped forward, pulling additional items from his medicine bundle, sage bundles, crystals that pulsed with their own light, and small carved figures that represented the spirits of the 4 directions. "The ritual requires precise timing," he said, beginning to arrange the objects in a complex pattern around the tiny village. "The anchor must maintain contact with both realms throughout the healing process, or the seal will fail and the wound will tear open completely." Above them, the dimensional rift suddenly expanded, revealing a glimpse of the entity that commanded the soul feeders. It was vast beyond comprehension, a thing of hunger and malevolence that existed to consume spiritual energy. Its presence in their reality was like acid eating through the fabric of existence itself, and Jed understood with terrifying clarity that it would not stop with the crossing place. Given enough time and access, it would devour every soul on Earth. "How long do we have?" he asked, watching the monster press against the dimensional barrier with increasing force. "Minutes," Running Bear replied, his hands moving with practiced precision as he completed the ritual circle. "Once the healing begins, the entity will realize what we're attempting and focus all its power on breaking through. If it succeeds before the seal is complete," he didn't need to finish the sentence. "If the entity broke through before Sarah could complete the healing from the other side, it would be loose in their world, with nothing to stop it from consuming every living soul in its path." The sacred bundle in Jed's hands grew so warm it was almost painful to hold, and the symbols on its leather wrapping began moving faster, rearranging themselves into patterns that seemed to describe the approaching ritual. Through some supernatural awareness, he could feel the lost souls gathering their combined spiritual energy. preparing to channel it through Sarah into the dimensional wound. "I need you to know," Sarah said, moving close enough that he could feel the warmth of her presence, despite her translucent form, "that these 5 years since my death haven't been suffering. I've been preparing for this moment, learning what I needed to know to heal the wound. Helping Henry Morrison find peace was just the beginning. Every soul you've helped has added to our strength." "There has to be another way," Jed insisted, though he could see in her eyes that she'd already accepted what was coming. "I just found you again. I can't lose you a second time." "You're not losing me," Sarah replied, her hand passing through his cheek like morning mist. "You're setting me free to do what I was meant to do. And when your time comes, many years from now, I'll be waiting on the other side of a healed world, the dimensional rift above." Them suddenly blazed with malevolent light as the ancient entity made its final push toward their reality. The ground beneath their feet trembled, and the remaining government agents fled in panic as their instruments registered energy readings that broke their calibration scales. Whatever was about to happen would reshape the fundamental nature of this place, possibly forever. Running Bear completed his ritual preparations and looked up at Jed with eyes that held the wisdom of centuries. "Are you ready, Mountain Man? Once this begins, there will be no turning back. The choice you make in the next few moments will determine not just the fate of these lost souls, but the safety of every living being in your world." Jed looked at Sarah one last time, memorizing every detail of her beloved face. Then he nodded, clutching the sacred bundle as Running Bear began the ancient chant that would either save their world or damn it to spiritual annihilation. The healing ritual had begun. Running Bear's chant began low and rhythmic, words in a language that predated written history flowing from his lips like water over stone. The sacred bundle in Jed's hands responded immediately, its leather wrapping growing so hot it almost burned his palms. The symbols, stitched into the hide, blazed with silver light, and suddenly Jed could see the spiritual energy flowing between the lost souls gathered in the tiny village. They were magnificent, 200 spirits from across 3 centuries, their forms now solid and radiant as they channeled their combined essence toward Sarah. Children who had died in winter storms stood beside miners killed in cave-ins, pioneers who had succumbed to disease, linking hands with native warriors who had fallen defending their homeland. All the divisions of race, religion, and nationality that had separated them in life dissolved in the face of their shared purpose. Sarah stood at the center of their circle, her own form blazing brighter than the sun as she absorbed their spiritual offering. But Jed could see the cost of the ritual etched in her face. Each soul's energy that flowed into her brought visible pain, as if she were taking their suffering into herself, along with their power. "She's taking on their unfinished business," Running Bear explained, his chant never wavering. "Every regret, every unfulfilled promise, every moment of pain they experienced before death. She must carry it all to heal the wound properly." Above them, the dimensional rift writhed like a living thing as the ancient entity sensed what was happening. Its alien intelligence probed the edges of the ritual, seeking weaknesses it could exploit. When it realized that the lost souls were willingly giving up their energy to power a healing that would trap it forever, its rage shook the very foundations of reality. The shadow entities swarming around the tiny village suddenly froze, then began flowing back toward the dimensional tear. They weren't retreating. They were being recalled, their master gathering all its servants for one final assault before the healing could be completed. The meadow grew darker as dozens of the creatures merged into a writhing mass of living shadow that pressed against the rift's edges from both sides. "Now, Jed!" Running Bear shouted over the growing supernatural storm. "You must make the connection while the ritual circle is still stable." Jed pressed his hands against the sacred bundle and felt the world explode into sensation. Suddenly, he could perceive reality from multiple dimensions simultaneously: the physical meadow, where his body knelt; the spiritual realm, where the lost souls gathered their power; and the nightmare space beyond the dimensional wound where the ancient entity raged against its imprisonment. The connection between worlds flowed through him like lightning, and he understood with crystal clarity what Running Bear had meant about needing an anchor. Without someone firmly grounded in the physical realm to serve as a conduit, the spiritual energy would dissipate harmlessly into the ether. But with Jed as a focus point, that same energy could be directed with surgical precision into the dimensional wound. "I can see it all," he gasped, his consciousness expanding to encompass the true scope of the entity's threat. It wasn't just hungry, it was infection given form, a spiritual disease that would corrupt every soul it touched. If it broke through into their reality, it wouldn't just feed on human spirits. It would transform them into extensions of itself, creating an army of the damned that would spread across the earth like a plague. Sarah began walking toward the dimensional rift, her form now so bright that looking directly at her was like staring into the heart of a star. The combined spiritual energy of 200 lost souls flowed through her, transforming her into something more than human. She was becoming a living seal, a barrier of pure spiritual force that could plug the wound in reality itself. But as she approached the rift, the ancient entity's assault intensified. The shadow entities it had recalled burst through the dimensional barrier in a coordinated attack, flowing across the meadow like a tsunami of living darkness. They ignored the government agents, who were still fleeing in panic, ignored Running Bear, who continued his chant despite the approaching doom, ignored even the tiny village where their feast awaited. They went straight for Jed. The creatures understood instinctively that he was the weak link in the ritual. If they could break his connection to the spiritual realm, the healing would fail and their master would be free to enter the physical world. They struck him with the force of a freight train, their touch like ice that burned as it froze. Pain beyond description tore through Jed's body and mind as the shadow entities attempted to drain his life force. But the sacred bundle in his hands blazed with protective power, and Running Bear's chant shifted to include words of warding that drove the creatures back with each syllable. Scout appeared from nowhere, launching himself at the nearest shadow entity with a courage that defied his canine understanding of what he faced. "Hold the connection," Running Bear commanded, his voice somehow cutting through the chaos. "Sarah needs 30 more seconds to complete the transformation." 30 seconds might as well have been 30 years. The ancient entity was pressing against the dimensional rift with such force that the air itself was beginning to tear, and more shadow entities poured through the widening gap with each passing moment. The meadow had become a battlefield where the laws of physics held no meaning, where spiritual energy clashed with dimensional hunger in a conflict that would determine the fate of both worlds. But Jed held on, channeling the power of 200 willing souls through his mortal frame, while Sarah approached the wound in reality that had been festering for over a century. The choice was no longer between losing her and saving her. It was between letting her sacrifice have meaning or watching her die for nothing as the ancient entity broke free to devour everything they'd ever loved. Sarah reached the dimensional rift just as the ancient entity made its final push toward their reality. The thing that emerged from the wound defied human comprehension, part shadow, part hunger, part living void that consumed light and hope with equal appetite. Its presence in the physical realm sent shockwaves through the fabric of existence, and Jed felt reality itself recoil from the contamination. "Now, my love," Sarah called out, her voice somehow carrying clearly over the chaos of battle. "Send me through." This was the moment Jed had dreaded since Running Bear first explained the ritual. To complete the healing, Sarah would have to enter the dimensional wound and seal it from within, becoming part of the barrier between worlds. Once she crossed that threshold, she would be lost to him forever, not dead, but existing in a state between life and death that precluded any possibility of reunion. The sacred bundle burned in his hands as he channeled the last of the lost soul's energy toward Sarah. One by one, the spirits around the tiny village were fading as they gave up their essence for the healing ritual. Their sacrifice was willing, even joyful, as they finally found the peace that had eluded them for decades or centuries. But each departure weakened the overall power available for the seal. "There's not enough energy," Running Bear shouted, his chant becoming ragged as the ancient entity's presence disrupted the spiritual flows he was trying to maintain. "We need more power to complete the seal." Sarah looked back at Jed one final time, her eyes blazing with love and determination. "There is enough," she said quietly, her words somehow reaching him despite the supernatural storm raging around them. "But only if you're willing to let me go completely. No holding back, no trying to keep a connection that would weaken the seal. Total release, Jed. Can you do that for me?" The question hung in the air like a physical weight. Everything in Jed's heart screamed against it. He'd already lost Sarah once to cancer, had spent 5 years learning to live with the hollow ache of her absence. To willingly send her away again, to actively participate in a separation that would last until the end of time itself, seemed like the cruelest joke the universe could play. But then he looked at the ancient entity, pressing against the dimensional barrier, saw the shadow creatures it commanded, preparing for another assault on the tiny village, and understood what was truly at stake. This wasn't just about his personal loss, or even about the 200 souls who had trusted him to help them find peace. If the entity broke through completely, it would transform their entire world into a feeding ground for spiritual parasites. Every child who would grow up in that nightmare realm, every soul that would be corrupted and consumed, every moment of love and joy that would be twisted into hunger and despair, all of it would be on his shoulders if he chose his own comfort over the greater good. "I can do it," he said, the words tearing themselves from his throat like pieces of his soul. "I can let you go." Sarah's smile was radiant with gratitude and love. "I'll be waiting for you," she promised. "When your time comes naturally, many years from now, I'll be there to welcome you home. But until then, live, Jed. Live fully and without regret, knowing that our love was strong enough to save the world." She turned toward the dimensional rift, her form now blazing so brightly that it illuminated the entire meadow. The combined spiritual energy of 200 lost souls flowed through her into the wound in reality, and Jed felt the ancient entity's rage turn to panic as it realized what was happening. With a sound like reality itself, screaming, Sarah stepped into the dimensional rift. The effect was immediate and catastrophic for the invading entity. The wound that it had been trying to widen suddenly began contracting, Sarah's sacrifice creating a seal of pure spiritual energy that cut off its access to their world. The shadow creatures throughout the meadow let out unified wails of anguish as they were pulled back through the closing portal, their forms dissolving as the connection to their master was severed. But the entity wasn't finished. In its death throes, it lashed out with every ounce of malevolence it possessed, trying to drag Sarah back through the closing wound to prevent the seal from completing. For a terrifying moment, Jed saw her form waver as the creature's power pulled at her essence. "The anchor!" Running Bear commanded. "Release the anchor connection, or she'll be torn apart." This was the final test, the ultimate act of love disguised as abandonment. To save Sarah from a fate worse than death, Jed had to cut the spiritual connection that linked them across dimensions. He had to willingly sever the last thread that bound them together, ensuring that the seal would hold, but also guaranteeing that he would never see her again. With tears streaming down his face, Jed opened his hands and let the sacred bundle fall to the earth. The spiritual connection snapped like a breaking cable, and Sarah's form stabilized within the dimensional wound just as it contracted to a point of light and vanished entirely. The ancient entity was gone. The wound in reality was healed, and Sarah was lost to him forever, her sacrifice complete and irreversible. The tiny village sat silent and empty, its purpose fulfilled, while Scout whimpered softly and pressed against Jed's legs in canine sympathy for a loss that transcended human understanding. 6 months later, Jed stood at the edge of the meadow where the tiny village had once bustled with supernatural life. The space looked exactly as it had before his first encounter with the impossible cabin. Wildflowers swaying in the mountain breeze, ancient trees standing sentinel at the forest's edge, and no trace of the dimensional wound that had nearly torn reality apart. Scout padded beside him, grayer around the muzzle than he'd been before their supernatural adventure, but still alert to the subtle changes in the forest around them. The dog had been Jed's constant companion through the difficult months of adjustment, seeming to understand that his master carried a grief too complex for ordinary consolation. Running Bear had vanished the morning after the ritual, along with his sacred bundle and any evidence that the healing ceremony had ever taken place. The only proof Jed had that the events weren't an elaborate hallucination was the complete absence of the strange energy readings that had drawn government attention. Agent Carlyle had returned twice, finding nothing but an aging mountain man who claimed to know nothing about dimensional rifts or supernatural entities. The lost souls were gone too, finally at peace after decades or centuries of waiting. Sometimes, on quiet evenings when the wind moved through the trees just right, Jed thought he could hear their voices whispering gratitude on the breeze. Henry Morrison's letter had found its place in the Boston Historical Society, and perhaps somewhere in whatever realm awaited beyond death. The old soldier was finally dancing with his beloved Mary, but Sarah's absence echoed through every moment of Jed's days. He'd thought losing her to cancer had been the worst pain imaginable, but at least then he'd been able to visit her grave, to speak to her memory, to imagine her at rest. Now she existed in a state between worlds, conscious and aware, but forever separated from everything she'd loved in life. The knowledge that she'd made this sacrifice willingly, out of love for him and for the world they'd saved together, somehow made the loss both easier and harder to bear. The cabin felt different now, larger in some ways, more empty in others. Jed had finally packed away some of Sarah's belongings, not to forget her but to honor the life she'd told him to live. Her rocking chair still sat by the window, but now Jed used it for reading the letters that had begun arriving from families whose ancestors had found peace. Through his supernatural missions, the Historical Society in Boston had forwarded dozens of thank you notes from Morrison descendants who'd learned about Henry's final letter. A Lakota elder had written to express gratitude for the return of sacred objects to a tribal burial ground, though Jed couldn't remember making that particular journey. It seemed that Running Bear had completed several unfinished missions on his behalf, tying up loose ends that stretched across decades of supernatural intervention. More importantly, new letters arrived every week from living people who needed help with problems that had nothing to do with lost souls or dimensional wounds. A family whose grandfather had disappeared in the mountains during a hunting trip. An elderly woman searching for her brother's remains from a plane crash in the 1960s. A park ranger dealing with unexplained phenomena that were probably natural but felt supernatural to those experiencing them. Jed had discovered a calling that extended beyond his role as guardian of supernatural crossing places. His reputation as someone who could find the lost and missing had spread through the mountain communities, and people began seeking him out for his tracking skills, his knowledge of the wilderness, and his hard-earned wisdom about grief and healing. "We've got purpose again, don't we, boy?" he said to Scout, who wagged his tail in response. The dog had adapted to their new role with enthusiasm, his enhanced senses proving invaluable for search and rescue operations that pushed the boundaries between the natural and supernatural worlds. As the sun set behind the western peaks, painting the sky in shades of gold and purple that Sarah had always loved, Jed felt a familiar presence in the evening air. Not Sarah herself. The barrier between worlds was complete and permanent, but something like an echo of her love, a reminder that the sacrifice she'd made had meaning beyond the dimensional wound they'd healed together. He pulled out a piece of paper and began writing by the fading light. composing a letter to a woman in Colorado whose husband had vanished during a solo hiking trip the previous spring. The man's body had never been found, and his widow needed closure that only someone with Jed's unique experience could provide. It would mean another journey away from these mountains, another family helped through the worst moment of their lives, another small victory against the forces of hopelessness that threatened to overwhelm the grieving. "Reckon we'll head out tomorrow," he told Scout, who immediately perked up at the prospect of travel. Mrs. Patterson's been waiting 6 months for answers about her husband. Time we gave her some peace. The stars emerged one by one as full darkness settled over the Timbervale woods. Somewhere among those distant lights, Sarah existed in a state Jed couldn't fully comprehend, but he'd learned to find comfort in the knowledge that her sacrifice had protected everything they'd both cherished. The crossing place was healed, the lost souls were at rest, and the world continued turning with the quiet certainty that love could triumph over even cosmic horror when given the chance. Standing to head back to his cabin, Jed caught a glimpse of movement at the edge of the meadow, a flash of blue fabric that might have been Sarah's favorite dress or might have been nothing more than moonlight on wildflowers. Either way, it reminded him that some connections transcended death, dimension, and distance. Love like theirs didn't end when the lovers were separated. It simply found new ways to express itself through service to others who needed hope in their darkest hours. Scout bounded ahead toward home, and Jed followed with the measured pace of a man who'd learned that every step forward was also a step toward whatever reunion awaited at the end of his own long journey. Until then, he had work to do, people to help, and a promise to keep, to live fully and without regret, carrying Sarah's love forward into a world made safer by her sacrifice.